This is Module 2, Competitive Markets and Efficiency, Part 1. So we're going to start out with a simple example of value creation through simple exchange based on selling my car. This is actually a photograph of not my car, but the same make and model, a 2008 Prius, which will play a role later in the course. But right now we're going to just imagine a case where I'm interested in selling my car. So let's say I have this car and I am enjoying using it. I get some value out of it. Looking around at the auto market, I've decided that this car is worth $1,200 to me. That is, replacing it with a similar car would cost me about $1,200. If somebody's willing to pay me more than that, I would sell it, but I would have to get at least $1,200 because that's what it's worth in my own use. And let's say someone comes along who we will call Jesse, and let's say that Jesse looks at my car and Jesse decides that the car is worth $1,500 to her. That is, Jesse, if she can get the car for less than $1,500, would be gaining value because she'd be paying less than $1,500 for something that's worth $1,500 to her. But if she had to pay more than $1,500, she just wouldn't buy it. She'd walk away. So the first thing to note is that there is the potential to create $300 in surplus by transferring this car from my use to Jesse's use. Now, who gets that surplus depends on how much Jesse actually pays me for the car. That is, where between $1,200 and $1,500 the price is set. I, of course, am not going to reveal that I'd be willing to sell it for anything over $1,200, and Jessie is not going to be willing to reveal that she'd be willing to pay up to $1,500. So we would start bargaining. Now, if the bargaining ended up at a price below $1,200, I would, of course, walk away. If the bargaining ended up at a price above $1,500, if I said I won't take anything less than $1,550, then she would walk away and no deal would get made. And if no deal got made, this $300 in potential surplus would be lost, what economists refer to as deadweight loss, or DWL. So deadweight loss is the potential for creating value that is not realized for some reason. In this case, if for some reason we just couldn't come to a deal, even though there is clearly, in this case, a deal to be made. So I would go in and I'd say, well, I'm really looking to get a fair price for this. I think that this car is worth, say, $1,600. And Jesse, of course, says, well, that may be the case, but I just couldn't afford it at that price. I really couldn't afford anything over $1,000. If you've ever bargained for a car, you know that this is how it goes. And gradually I'd say, well, maybe I can come down a bit. And she'd say, well, maybe I can figure out how to scrape together a bit more money. And let's say we did that and we ended up at a price of $1,340. Well, if we did, I'd be selling the car for more than the $1,200 I value it at, and Jessie would be buying it for less than the $1,500 she'd be willing to pay for it. In fact, if we ended up at a price of $1,340, the $300 in surplus that would get created would be divided between Severin getting $1,340 minus $1,200 equals to $140 in surplus, and Jesse getting $1,500 minus the $1,340 that she ended up having to pay equal to $160 in surplus. So Jesse would be getting a little bit more of the surplus than I would, but we'd both be getting significant surplus from the exchange. Now, of course, if I wasn't a very good bargainer and Jesse really made me believe she couldn't afford anything over $1,210, and I sold it to her for $1,210, I'd get $10 in surplus and she'd get $290. Or if I managed to push the price up to $1,470, then she'd only be getting $30 in surplus and I'd be getting $270. So any price between $1,200 and $1,500 would create an exchange in which each of us gets some value, but where it falls between those two prices would determine how much value. Now let's change the example slightly. It's still my car. I still value it at $1,200. Jesse still values it at $1,500. But let's say now there is a transfer tax. And this transfer tax is $75. And it represents real costs. Whenever you sell a car, you have to do a bunch of paperwork, and that takes the time of government employees, and that ends up costing society $75 in the time and other materials that go into transferring the car. Well, the first thing to note then is if there's a $75 transfer tax that represents real resources being used, then there isn't $300 in surplus available anymore. Now there's only $225 in surplus. The $300 that is created by me transferring the car to Jesse minus the $75 that in real resources that gets used in order to make that transfer. Let's say for a moment that the seller has to pay the transfer tax. Well, if that's the case, then the minimum I'd be willing to sell the car for is $1,275, and the maximum that Jesse would be willing to pay for the car is still $1,500. And we'd be back to the original story that there would be $1,500 minus $1,275, or $225 in surplus that could be created. I wouldn't sell it for anything less than $1,275. Where between $1,275 and $1,500 we end up bargaining to would determine how we split that $225 in surplus. Now let's change the example slightly. Let's take a case where the transfer tax is $125. But the extra $50 is not actually a real cost to the government. There's still $75 in paperwork costs, but they're charging you more than that, $125. Well, in that case, the amount of surplus transferring the car from me to Jesse creates is still $225. Because there's besides my $1,200 lost value in using it, there's also the $75 of paperwork. And Jesse gets $1,500 out of it. The extra $50 the government gets just means that the government is taking some of the surplus. So in this case, there's $225 in surplus available, of which the government's going to take $50. Above their actual costs, they're just going to take some of the surplus. And when that's the case, there's only going to be $175 in surplus for me and Jesse to divide up. So if I have to pay $125, I wouldn't be willing to sell it for anything less than $1,325, and Jesse wouldn't be willing to pay more than $1,500. We would come to some price that would be above $1,325, below $1,500. When we did, that would still create $225 in surplus, of which Jesse and I would split $175 depending on what price we end up at, and the government would get $50 because the government would endure costs of $75 but would have charged a tax of $125. Now all of this it comes out exactly the same way if Jesse has to pay the tax instead of me. If Jesse has to pay the tax instead of raising the $1,200 above $1,200 my willingness to sell, we'd be lowering below $1,500 Jesse's willingness to buy. If she had to pay a $75 transfer tax, this would go down to $1,425, and I would still be willing to sell at anything above $1,200. And likewise here, Jesse's willingness to pay would go down to $1,375, and I'd still be willing to pay or sell at anything above $1,200. Now we're going to do one more example before we move on, and that is the case where the government charges a much higher tax, so much higher that the deal doesn't get made. So just to remind you, my actual value of the car is $1,200. Jesse's value of the car is $1,500. The government has $75 in paperwork costs to do the transfer. So we know there's $225 in surplus available. The $300 difference between Severin and Jesse minus the $75 in real cost to transfer the car. But let's say the government charges a transfer tax equal to $400. Well, if that's the case, you probably can see right away, Jesse and I are not going to be able to make a deal. Because if I have to pay the tax, I'm not going to be willing to accept anything less than $1,600. The $1,200 the car is worth to me, plus I have to pay this tax of $400. But that's more than Jesse's willing to pay. If Jesse has to pay the tax, then she's not going to be willing to pay anything more than $1,100 for the car because the car's only worth $1,500, plus she has to pay this $400 to the government. So that would be less than I'd be willing to accept, so we wouldn't make a deal. And when we fail to make that deal, the $225 in surplus that could have been created is lost. And that is deadweight loss. That is, here is a deal that could have created $225 in surplus, but we fail to create it. In this case, it's because there is a tax that is so large that it actually makes it not worth doing the deal. Now, later in the class, we're actually going to look at the opposite situation where deals are made because some of the costs of those deals are not borne by the buyer or seller, particularly environmental externalities. When a generator creates electricity and sells it to a consumer, but they don't have to pay for the air quality damage they do. In that case, you sometimes get deals done that shouldn't be done, that actually the buyer wouldn't be willing to pay enough if they had to pay the full cost. And then you get deadweight loss of, in a sense, the opposite type, deals that are getting done even though they create negative surplus. So the last point I want to make before we move on is that the example we've done so far is just pure exchange. The car already existed. All I was doing was selling it in its current state to Jesse. But there's nothing special about that, it turns out. It turns out that even when we're doing production, the argument is exactly the same. So what is production? What is producing a good? It's putting together a bunch of inputs. Each of those inputs has an alternative use where it has some value in the alternative use. When you put those inputs together and they create a good that somebody's willing to pay more for than the cost of each of the inputs added up, then that creates surplus. Just as my selling the car to Jessie creates surplus because she's willing to pay more for it than my cost of not having it, that is my willingness to sell it, of $1,200. So this example was just exchange, but this same idea applies when we start saying, well, how much does it cost a company to produce a good? That is adding up all of the different input costs, summing up the input costs to come up with the company's willingness to sell. And we can then make exactly the same argument. If the company's willingness to sell, that is the sum of all of their input costs, is less than my willingness to buy, then surplus can be created by the deal, setting aside the pollution issue for a moment. But if all the costs of benefits are borne by the buyer and seller, then we can create a willingness to sell by the seller by simply looking at the input costs, or when we do this in a more general sense, the marginal cost to the company of creating that one additional good. And so that is how surplus gets created in an economy, and that's the concept we're going to use for the rest of the course.